Hello and welcome to this session of the Pathlock Innovation Series. We're excited to have you here as part of this series. This is our roundtable discussion, Achieving a True Enterprise View of Business Risk and Control Effectiveness. We have several presenters here today from Siemens Healthineers, GRC 2020, and a few people from Pathlock. And they will introduce themselves in just a moment.
All right, well, I will take it over from here. I'm going to act as the moderator for today's discussion. My name is Mike Peterbaugh. I am the CMO here at Pathlock, and it is my honor to present with my co-presenters here today. I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves. So I'm going to start with, just going to move from left to right. Mr. Rasmussen, would you please introduce yourself?
Sure, I'm Michael Rasmussen of GRC 2020 Research. I've got 30 years total experience and 23 of them as an analyst. So my job is research. I spend my days understanding what are the challenges companies face in the context of governance, risk management, and compliance, and how do they go about solving those challenges with strategy, process, and technology. I spent 7 years at Forrester Research as one of their top analysts and 16 to 17 years now competing against Gartner and Forrester in the market research analyst world.
That's great. Thanks for joining us today, Michael. Harold, joining us from Germany, I believe, correct?
Yes, hello, and I believe good morning to US or good afternoon, and yeah, hello, and thank you very much for the invitation. My name is Harold Hildebrand. I'm leading the SAP compliance, authorizations, and security part for Siemens Healthineers, which is the Siemens medical business of the Siemens Group. And as my second role, I'm also the head of internal controls and assessment for the whole Siemens Healthineers part worldwide. I'm within Siemens since close to 20 years in various positions and various countries. And yeah, our company using Pathlock or security review solutions quite a while from the very beginning. And yeah, thanks for the invitation. Happy to join my thoughts and look forward to the discussions.
Carrie Bowman, I'm a Senior Director of Product Marketing for Pathlock, but in my prior life, I was an SAP security SME, so I spent 14 plus years doing that, where I specialized in role design, redesign, customization of rule sets, and I also have my CISA, so I, in particular, focused on governance and compliance initiatives for companies, so helping them set up standard operating procedures and really identifying ways to effectively manage their compliance initiatives. So after that, I moved over to the software side of the house and actually was a product owner of an application GRC solution before coming to Pathlock to be part of the product marketing team. So very happy to be here today.
Okay, great. While Mike is getting back on, can we go to the next slide, Carrie? Let's go ahead with the first question. The first question is, do you feel most organizations have a complete view of risk across their organization? And what are the biggest challenges hindering this view?
Well, from my perspective, a lot of organizations lack a complete view of risk. In fact, I wrote a blog article in December of 2019 called A Tale of Two Futures, taking a spin on Charles Dickens' Tale of Two Cities. Are we headed towards that Blade Runner future or that Star Trek future, that dystopia of Blade Runner, or that, you know, much more cooperative, tech-friendly world of Star Trek? But the whole point in that article was that, you know, you look at a lot of enterprise risk management programs, and a lot of times they're dominated by IT risks and fail to really see the expanse of environmental risks, health and safety risks, to strategic risks, to fraud risks and corruption risks and all this. But I mean, IT security risks are huge. I'm not trying to deny that. That's where I started my career. But I've seen a lot of organizations fail to have a full, complete view of enterprise risk because different departments have different views of what risk is. And so often we work in little myopic silos and don't see across that. But things are changing. I think the last several years where we've seen COVID-19, a war in Ukraine, supply chain disruptions, economic uncertainty and inflation, geopolitical risk, I think more and more we're seeing organizations take on a much more proper enterprise view of risk, a more complete view of risk. But what's often lacking is an enterprise view of controls. If we have an enterprise view of risk, that really means that we should also have an enterprise view of controls. If we have a risk, there's 4 things we can do with that risk. We can accept that risk as it is. We can avoid that risk by making a decision where there's no longer a risk, if that's a possibility. We can insure or transfer the risks, like through insurance policies, derivatives, hedging, or the one we focus on most often is we mitigate the risk. And how do we mitigate risk? We implement controls. We have our inherent risk here, and we implement control A, B, and C. It comes out with this residual risk that we find acceptable. But too often I see organizations try to have an enterprise view of risk, but they have a fragmented view of controls, and that doesn't make sense. To have an enterprise risk management program requires that not only do we have an enterprise view of risks, but we also have an enterprise view of controls. That's my thoughts on the question.
Yeah, and I would absolutely second that, right? So my background, similarly working for multiple different companies, the thing that I started every conversation with is visibility. We don't know what we don't know. So without having that visibility, we don't know what we have to tackle. And once we identify what our true risk environment is across the landscape, then we can start talking about governance. And when we talk about governance, exactly to Michael's point, right, we need to be able to not just say, here is the risk, but if we choose to accept that risk, which is a very common occurrence, then we need to be able to manage those controls, because if we don't actually manage them and ensure that they're operating effectively, were we really mitigating the risk to begin with? So it's really just continuing to move our way up that capability maturity model, right? Establish that the risk exists and then follow it through to its conclusion. But Harold, I'd love to hear your perspective as someone who's in the business. How do you, both from the SAP side of the house that you work on, but also with being in the compliance side, how do you ensure that you're getting that full view?
Yeah, I do believe we have a very good view on the overall risks. But what we also do have, and this is what you guys already said, right? There is a huge gap between the high-level risk on the very high-level top management to the very granular risks out there in the operations, right? So, and that's always the question, how to get these things together and also have proper controls in between. And why is that so? I believe especially big organizations, right, have not always heterogeneous IT landscapes, right? You're buying companies and you have M&A business around the globe, and with permanent in and out, right? You have to deal with that different landscapes all the time. And that for sure brings new risks in, which takes a little while to identify. And if, for example, we acquired a Variant company 2.5 years ago, are still in the integration, and we are learning every day, right? And then the same side on the other side. And that, I believe, is an ongoing challenge, right? But I do believe people and companies investing in that, they need to. They're also driven, right? So especially if you're a medical device producing company like we do, you're also forced to have a proper risk management here, because in the end, it's all about the patient, which is lying under our machine in the end. Yeah, it's a challenge, right? And but it's worth doing it.
I think that goes nicely into the next question that we have. And again, I think this is where I'm interested to hear both of your thoughts. So what are future investments you think should be made in this market, and where do you see the market going? So, you know, Harold, you kind of hit on the fact that you're in a market, in particular in an industry that requires regulation. But, you know, so maybe from your side, where do you see your industry going? And then maybe Michael, from your perspective, other industries maybe that are less regulated, but can still find value, significant value in, you know, being compliant with different controls frameworks. You know, where do you see that going as well?
So maybe if I start, there are two topics, right? So first of all, Siemens has quite a long background in compliance, right? So therefore, I don't know any other company on this planet which had such a, I would say, compliance mindset now implemented over more than a decade, also in the head of every employee, which is good, right? So we learned it, yeah, we did our lesson, and we moved on from the, I would say, bad sheep to the white knight in the end, but this was a long journey and cost a lot of money. But in the end, we did it and we learned a lot, right? So that's one thing. So compliance is a mindset thing. It's not only to having controls, doing left and right. In the end, it's always human beings, and in the end, and it's always a question of, there is a lot of effort in fraud. Yeah. So there's always a topic to say, what should you do as a company to cover it against it, and what is still worth the money, because in the end it's also costing a lot of money. So this is a topic you have to decide as a company. We said we do much more than the standard. We try to implement the standard. That's one thing. On the other side, you're always in line or working against the technology, which is completely changing every 5, 10, 15 years, right? And from having a very centralized, huge monolith SAP world or Oracle world or whatever you take, so we definitely see that the world is changing. We get more and more distributed landscapes. Yeah, there's more and more cloud-based, and also more and more technologies coming in. So facing SAP years ago only ABAP-based, you now have to deal with Java-based systems. Yeah, you have to base with cloud analytics, with the business transformation platform, and a lot more. And this is the challenge you have, right? So having a mindset, having controls, and fitting, develop them, fitting your permanent changing landscape and new technology, which brings for sure new threats somehow, but also new opportunities for sure. This is the fun part of the game. Developing a framework around which is fitting in the end.
Absolutely. Michael, your thoughts? Anything in particular? You mentioned it's been 4 years since you wrote your original article around specifically where do we go from here. Do you see us going towards the Star Trek future, or are we headed towards Blade Runner here?
I think it's probably going to be somewhere in between.
How do we change that mindset?
I think it's going to be somewhere in between, but organizations need to be making investments in enterprise view of controls and control monitoring automation to match their enterprise risk programs. And in that context, we also need a lot of controls around things of ESG, environmental social governance. And this is absolutely huge in Europe, where 50,000 firms have to start CSRD reporting, but now you also have the CSDDD, the EU's Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. I mean, it's absolutely huge, and it's having a global impact. I'm talking to US firms, Australian firms, firms all over the world that are concerned about the EU's regulations around ESG. And they require ongoing continuous due diligence monitoring, and that includes controls within your business and across your supply chain third-party relationships. Now, some of the challenges is that a lot of US organizations think about ESG is all about climate change. Well, guess what? The E in ESG, climate change is just a part of it. It's not even all of it. But you unpack the S and you get inclusivity and diversity and privacy and those elements. But you unpack the G and you get internal controls over financial reporting, information security, fraud, bribery and corruption, tax transparency, beneficial ownership, and there's controls in the environment. So a lot of organizations, as they start building ESG programs, need to be thinking of the E, the S, and the G on internal controls, and how do we automate this and monitor it throughout our business, because there's significant regulations that are in play already or coming to play.
Absolutely. And I'm going to take that opportunity to go to the next question, because I think it leads into it very well. So what you were just mentioning, right, around different plays that are occurring right now that are causing us to need to strengthen various different internal controls and whatnot. You know, as a top driver, right, new regulations, that's always a driver, right, especially if we either in an industry or a country that requires us to meet certain regulations. So, I mean, I'd be interested for both of you. Again, I know, Harold, you're in a highly regulated industry to begin with. And Michael, you've hit on some of the key regulations that are coming out in different places. From my perspective, it's one of two things that's usually a top driver for strengthening our internal controls. It's either we're required to by law, so we have to, we don't have a choice, right? Especially here in the States, if we're reporting to shareholders because we've gone public, we have to report the results of that. So if something negative happens, it has a direct impact on our bottom line. The other driver that I see is we have either an executive level at the top who really understands the potential impact of risks and lack of controls. And so they really drive that from the top down. I mean, I think Harold said it perfectly. Compliance is a mindset. If you have someone who understands the potential impact of the risks, they have that mindset that compliance is key because of what we're trying to avoid, right? It might be that we're trying to avoid significant operational failures, or it might be that we're trying to avoid fraud, because that's kind of always in my practice when I was in SAP Security SME. That was the second reason I was always brought in, was because they had fraud occur. And, you know, the average data breach, right, costs more than $4 million to a company. And 80% of data breaches occur because of misuse of existing access, right, or mismanagement of it. And so when we have, on average, 96 companies live in both an on-prem and SaaS world, so hybrid, And on average, they've got 36 plus SaaS applications. I mean, how do you manage all of that and the risk if you do not have a strong controls process in place? So I've just seen as we continue to get more complex that we really have to have processes in place to even attempt to manage it. But
yeah, and that's true, Carrie, right? And in the end, so our goal in Siemens as a Siemens group, but especially also in Healthineers, is always to have an invisible net, right? So the people have the mindset, they know there is something behind the scenes, and the challenge is really to enable and protect our staff and also the company for sure, right? From fraud, but also from failures on one side. But if something happened, they know we are there, we are behind the scenes, yeah, and we find it. That's one thing. And on the other side, as you said, right, you are driven by regulations, but you have, I would say, a codex as a company, yeah. And this is also the attitude you have as a company, how you're making a business, right? And in the end, from a regulation perspective, we are highly FDA regulated for sure because we are a medical device company, but also audit-wise, we are, I would say, one of the most audited parts around. There's the audit standard now coming, the ISA 315, right, which definitely changes the way audits are done, and also from the auditors have to understand the whole landscape, how are systems working together, how are interfacing working together, how is the data flowing between the systems, and that's in the end also makes it round regarding the data protection, right? GDPR is a topic, and doesn't matter where you are in the world. In the moment you have European customers in there, European vendors, yeah, tracking, behaving, whatever, then you are fully, GDPR relevant and needs to be compliant there. And this is not always in the mindset of the people in the world and on the companies. And this is something really we are working on. Let's take data deletion and retention. So there are systems out in the world, 25 plus years old, never thrown away one piece of data because it was just designed that way. And now coming with GDPR, implementing such a thing, it's a challenge. And on the other side, cybersecurity is also a huge topic, which is somehow going in there, because if somebody breaks in your system, steals the data, then you also have GDPR issues, right? What is about ransomware and so on. So there's a huge connection between the compliance, audit, data protection, cybersecurity, and all of that. And in the end, I would say you need to have an overview in your company about the existing controls, right? But also missing controls, the control execution, and also an overall status, because if top management asks you as a leader, you need to be aware, need to answer to say, yep, here we are, this is the percentage of implementation, and these are the areas where we still maybe struggling or still developing, right?
absolutely. And I think that was a great overview of how some different, like you said, GDPR, different frameworks like that, that we should consider. And Michael, to kind of hand it over to you and to go off of that, one of the questions that we have is, how do you provide continued assurance to senior leaders and boards over the effectiveness of your GRC processes? You did a great job of describing, how we need to think of different processes, implement them, and, with your example of ESG, right, how complex it can be. How do you explain that complexity to the senior leadership and give them, what can we do internally, as both leaders and as the people who are the day-to-day processors of this, what can we do to give that assurance to senior leaders that we're covering all of our bases?
Gosh, I mean, we can go so many directions of that.
I know, right? It's not a broad question at all.
I mean, one of the big things to clearly understand is, what do we mean by GRC? And to go back to the GRC definition by OSEG, that's found in the OSEG GRC capability model, which is the only publicly vetted standard for governance, risk, and compliance GRC across those. There's lots of standards that tackle things in silos. But in that context, GRC is a capability to reliably achieve objectives. That's the governance function. And address uncertainty, that's risk management. In fact, the ISO 31000 International Standard of Risk Management defines risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives, so there's a relationship, and act with integrity, that's compliance. So GRC is a capability to reliably achieve objectives, address uncertainty, and act with integrity. Those objectives can be entity level objectives, They could be division, department, process, like accounts payable objectives, accounts receivable, procurement objectives, payroll objectives. I mean, there's objectives there. They can be asset level objectives like EU citizen information, that we have certain objectives to protect that relate back to GDPR. And so we have different types of objectives in the organization, and we have to manage the uncertainty and risk to those objectives. And we have to manage the integrity, which is all the compliance and the values, the ethics, as we achieve those objectives as well. And so to me, when we want to provide assurance to senior leaders and boards on GRC process effectiveness is how well are we understanding the objectives of the organization, whether they're high level entity objectives down into process objectives, and how are we managing risk and compliance in context with that? How are we trending for issues, incidents, cases, control weaknesses, failures, or year over year? What are we doing to be able to help the organization leverage controls so that we can be high-performing organizations?
Absolutely. And Harold, from your perspective, are any of those things that Michael mentioned similar things that you report on up to senior leadership to show effectiveness?
Definitely. So what we did in Siemens quite a time ago, we did a lot in the purchase to pay framework, right? Because there we have the most problems. So what we did is here, we went from the point to say, okay, prevent what's possible, but and what's possible means having a certain spend against the benefit, right? And it's not written that you're not allowed to have something, right? But you need to be insured adequately. But then afterwards, if something happens, you need to find it. You need to detect it, right? So you have the prevent part, and you have the detect part, and then you have the monitoring part where we say zero tolerance, right? Since many, many years. And what we did is we have a very high SOD framework, right, around where we're using security beaver, now part of the pass log, where we're having 40 controls, for example, in all of our subsystems, checking standard basic things, checking also purchasing to pay. Then we have preventive application controls, which in the end are helping us to make the system clever enough against errors or wanted errors or fraud or whatever. And then we have continuous controls, monitoring, checking the business transaction, because if you are protecting the system plus the user, in the end, what they do is business, and then you need to care about the business transactions. And since the last years, we are more and more going to the real-time near detection, right? Also combined with a very high framework of process auditor controls, where we in the end have a one-click audit now implemented, right? So I would say 80%, 90% of our ITGC controls are fully automatic, and we are on the way now to a continuous audit cycle, meaning our aim or our target in the future is not auditing by controls anymore. The controls are there, they're running permanently, and we are only auditing how is the organization dealing with alerts, right? Because we know the control is efficient, but how is the organization dealing with the results? I believe this is the next step we are now working on. And then in the end, having a continuous monitoring and reporting, and also escalation plus consequences, right? That's how you should do it.
Absolutely. And, when you speak about that, right, consequences as well as monitoring and things, we talk about you're obviously very compliance driven, but you do have business objectives around being successful in accomplishing this.
Yeah.
How do you balance those two? You mentioned right now you've got 80% or so of your ITGCs that are automated, so you're managing that. But as Michael mentioned, right, there are so many potential risks out there and so many things that we need to address. I apologize for the pop-up, everyone. How do you balance that? How do you balance what you need to accomplish to be compliant, but with realistically the cost and the time, and the level of effort it takes to do that?
Yeah, in the end, it's a risk-based approach, like you said, right? So you need to look at the processes, you need to look at the systems in the end, you need to check what is there, and how can you automate things, because this is the key, right? Automation, if it's once done, it's permanent there and it's with less effort. And this is the calculation you have to do around, what are we willing to take, right? Or what are we saying, doesn't matter what it costs, we're protecting it. Just to let you know, you mentioned GDPR in the beginning. So we as a Helsingers part of a Siemens business, right? So we are a $22 billion company. But if there is a GDPR breach, we have to pay 4% of the Siemens Group's total turnover, which is $100 billion at the moment. So spending $4 billion for such a case could flip such a company or such a part of the company. And this is definitely where we say, doesn't matter what it costs to invest, because this is always a benefit, right? So these are in the end the risk-based approaches to say, what are you taking, what not? Yeah, what are you fixing by hard controls, yeah, or by authorizations or by preventive actions in the system? Or what are you also saying, I do a regulation, I do a guideline, I trust my employees, they will do the right thing because they are trained, they know it. It's not always hard monitoring, it's always caring about the people, train them, right? And also make them clear why certain things need to run a certain way. Yeah, and also show them what could be consequences if they do not, right? Because that's in the end, everything you can more or less prevent at the beginning, you don't need to fix afterwards. You also don't need to identify.
I love that view.
And I could.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah, jump in.
I could talk a lot on this particular one, but I mean, compliance versus business objectives, and some of it's where in the world you are. There's a huge difference between the European focus on compliance and risk and what you see in the US. I'm actually much busier in Europe and the United Kingdom right now than I am in North America. I'm seeing so much traction out of particularly the DACH region of Germany, the DACH region of Europe, the German-speaking region of Europe, the Nordics, Benelux, and the United Kingdom, just buried with interactions related to controls and risk, compliance, and ESG. But it's a very different mindset you see in Europe than you do in the US. Europe is much more of a business risk-driven approach to governance, risk, and compliance. The US is very much a checklist, compliance-driven approach. In the US, we should be calling it CRG, or just even C, or just CR, and even just drop the G. While in Europe, it's much more of GRC. It's about the governance and flowing into the risk and the compliance. You see this in regulations. In the US regulations, too often, what companies want is a checklist. You know, tell me what I have to do. Let me check the check boxes. Then I want my get out of jail free card. While in Europe, what started over in the United Kingdom with the FSA, the Financial Services Authority, which eventually became the FCA in the UK, you had, 20 years ago, what they called principles and outcome-based regulation, which then became part of the EU Better Regulatory Policy. And it's focused, a lot of the regulation in Europe doesn't focus on a checklist. It tells you what you have to do, what you have to achieve. The way one company might achieve it is different from the way another company achieves. And it takes a much more risk-based approach to compliance that you don't see in the United States.
Yeah, I believe a good mixture is key, makes the difference, I believe, right? Because business for sure drives also a lot of functions, right? Like the IT, for example. But on the other side, IT especially enables the business more and more, right? And companies getting more and more digital. So IT is not only the necessary evil to do operations, they are now more and more part. And in Siemens, we do a lot of business anyway, IT virtually based, right? So our virtual product, software based, and whatever. So it's both worlds growing together, becoming one more and more. And in the end, you need a little bit of both, right? But as Mike said, there is a difference in the world of mindset. And in the end, I would say having a good mixture, that's important. And for sure, you need a lot of communication, a lot of information to the employees, to management, and also to the business, do the alignments and make them clear why things are necessary, right? Because me saying, hey, IT, business, look here, this is your subsystem, it's owned by you, it's your data. If you don't care about deletion retention, it's a GDPR problem, right? They say, thank you for letting me know. I didn't even thought about that, right? And this is where IT enables the business. On the other side, business says, hey, dear IT, look here, we have new processes, new whatever. We need to have a protection here, help us, right? So in the end, it's a collaboration between both sides, and having a good mixture in the end makes a difference, in my opinion.
I absolutely agree. I think that was always one of the biggest things when I was working in SAP security and working with their teams to set up governance programs, or to Michael's point, compliance programs. It was so much of it was just education, getting the business in the room and saying, just because IT is responsible for granting you the access, that does not mean that they own all of the risk. Your users are the ones utilizing it. They're doing different things, and really getting them to understand the potential impact so that they too would take ownership over that. Because if they took ownership, it was a far more effective program. And I'm going to take that and lead into this next one. Business and stakeholder needs when implementing a GRC solution. I always, when I would go in and talk to customers about implementing a GRC tool in particular, That was the conversation I had with them. Yes, IT may be the buyer of this, and IT is doing it so that they can more effectively provision you access, and also so that when audit comes to the table and says, I need reports from you on change management, on provisioning, etc., that you can more effectively pull it so that those reports are standardized. But it also behooves business to be part of that conversation, right? What does business want to get out of a solution? What are they looking for? Because it impacts them not just for provisioning, but for things like certifications, reviews of user access that are a very common thing that business has to perform. A tool would be how they now go about doing that. So is this tool providing them with all the information they need that's relevant to actually be able to effectively make that decision of, do I let this user retain this access? Because what if this access comes along with a risk, right? And maybe it's a risk that we're mitigating or a risk we've accepted. We still want to be aware of that. What about users who have similar access or who are similar type users? Did they have the same access or not? How did this user get access granted to them? When was it last used? That sort of contextual information. But if the business isn't part of that selection of a GRC solution, they don't get to have that input. So then they're kind of just stuck with whatever IT chooses versus that team effort of, selecting what's best for everyone. So that's my thoughts on the initials, but around shortening time to value, right? My biggest thing there is always taking a look at what you're using your solution for, right? If you're using it for provisioning, for certifications, there's some easy back of the napkin math that can be done there around, okay, if I typically take 80 hours to provision and I can drop it to 8 hours, hey, that's a win. That's a significant change. If my certifications take me 4 weeks to prep and I can do it in 1 week instead, that's a shortened time to value. I make it quicker for audit because the things are standardized. But there's a lot to take into consideration. I'd be really interested, Michael, from your perspective of solutions that are out there, and then Harold, from what you've done internally with Security Weaver and your implementation, how did you best manage that GRC solution selection process, that identifying time to value, and again, getting both IT and business on the same page, and audit for what you wanted to select and how you made your choice?
Yeah, I believe, first of all, you have to understand which environment is there, right, where you are. Then you need to align with the enterprise risks, right, but also then go deeper, close the gap until you are reaching really the last step in the end, meaning align with the key functions, with the key processes like supply chain, accounting, order to cash, sales and service, understand what is in there. And in the end, really do a risk-based approach. We do not want to hinder our business making business. We would like to protect them. And behind the scenes, being the invisible net. And in the end, explain the need, right? Create the urgency as a next step, right? And also, as said, show the consequences if there's nothing there and something happened. And then definitely plan it in, and stick to it and go through. And what we learned is what makes it, makes it more faster is if you have solutions which are really purpose-built, easy to use. And this is where we took the Security Weaver solutions back in 27, 28, started with them because they are focused, I would say, easy to use tools, and not a huge GRC suite with 36 modules where nobody really knows what do I need and what not. And in the end, we really said, okay, let's use this for emergency user handling. Let's use that for SOD. Let's use this for provisioning. Let's use this for transactional archiving or monitoring or whatever. And then showing the progress, showing the benefit, align with the functions and the processes. And in the end, stick to the risk-based approach. And then people really will help you and follow you instead of flooding them with something they don't want. That will never work.
Absolutely. Michael, any, with this being our kind of last broadest question here, any thoughts from you around this in particular? I specifically around best approach to change management, your thoughts on that? I'd be interested to hear.
To go to the top level question, what business and stakeholder needs should you consider when implementing a GRC solution? I mean, the word consider is there, so I would say all of them. I mean, we should consider all the business and stakeholder needs. Now, whether we can meet every need or want or desire, that's another question, or something to consider. But when it comes to implementing a GRC solution, we should look at the complete range of business and stakeholder needs, and see what we can accommodate within a GRC solution and approach. And when we look to accommodate things, it's not just to put additional layers of bureaucracy and oversight that slow the business down, but it's to make the business much more effective, efficient in achieving its objectives. And building a business case when you approach change management because GRC can be like a huge project with a lot of change. It can also be Japanese Kaizen, those small incremental changes over time as well. But whenever we have an approach where here's our current state, and we're going to implement some change management, and here's our future state we're driving towards, whether it's going to take us 3 months, 6 months, or 2 years to get to that future state, there's a before and there's an after. And in building that business case, you should be able to model it around 4 areas. The efficiency, which is traditional ROI. The current state costs us this much in time and money. The future state with implementing this solution should cost us this much. And what's the delta? Before it took us 200 hours to build that report for the board of directors. Now it takes us 5 minutes. Literally, I mean, that's one of the figures I've used in one of these business cases. 80% of our staff time is actually managing documents, spreadsheets, and emails before. After, we expect that to go down to less than 10% or 5%. But that's the efficiency. Effectiveness is the next one to measure the change around, before and after. And that really is a risk assessment itself. We have our inherent risk, like let's say before PathLock, since we're on a PathLock webinar. We have our inherent risk before PathLock. If we implement PathLock, this is our residual risk. And what's that measurement, that delta? I mean, and that risk reduction can be seen around more things getting done, greater monitoring of controls, less things slipping through cracks, all those type of elements. The third element of value to build a business case around is resilience. Our current state versus this future state, how quickly with this future state are we going to be able to identify control issues and catch them when they're still small before they become big, and be able to recover from them. And then the fourth area of value to measure is agility. How do we keep up with regulatory change, risk change, and business change, and keep all that change in sync? Or because the before state, we might be constantly 6 months behind the game, where we don't want to be. We want to be continuously monitoring our control environment and our risks in real time, not 6 months behind.
And one remark to that, maybe from my side. So what we also learn is you need a strong governance in the processes, right? So otherwise you will never get it done, and forget it that you make it right to everybody, right? This in a company like the Siemens Group, close to 350,000 employees, you will not make it right to everybody. That's just impossible. So a recommendation is having a strong governance, which for sure has the flexibility to cover the business needs. That's important, right? Because business is different. Building medical devices is different from switch electronics or from trains or whatever. But at a certain stage, you need to have a governance which says, yes, this is the main process. You have some options around left and right, but until there's the border and here's the end, otherwise we will never get it done, right? This is also what we learned is important to have.
Establishing those standards, right? Standardized documented processes that we can make repeatable, and then we can include solutions that will make them automated. And I think my biggest takeaway, or just reaffirmation of my beliefs, it's great to hear that both Harold, you're implementing it internally, and that Michael, you see this as well, is just this idea of create the urgency, see the value. If the people in our organization understand the value of what we're trying to accomplish with governance and risk and compliance measures, then they will help us implement those, and they will help us succeed at being able to meet all of those standards. Any closing words from either of you as we wrap up here?
I mean, to me, it goes back to so much what we said, but keeping the objectives in focus, the business objectives and how those map to the control objectives. When we talk about risk first or compliance, to me, that's putting the cart before the horse. Like going back to the area of ESG, where we can't talk about ESG risks without understanding ESG objectives. Your business might have an objective to be carbon neutral. Your business might have an objective to not do business with people that are known for child labor, forced labor. We might have an objective to, avoid bribery and corruption in our business and U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. We have objectives. Only when we have those objectives, we then understand the controls that get in place and the risks that map to all that.
So we could say, define your goals or your objectives, establish a plan to accomplish those, establish standardized processes and procedures to be followed, and then execute successfully on those, be it manual or with a solution. Wonderful. Well, Stephanie, are you there? And can I hand over to you for closing remarks?
Yep. Thank you so much to all of you for your presentations. We apologize for the technical difficulties at the very beginning, but I have a few announcements before we close. But before I do, we had one question from the audience. It says, with AI evolving, what would be the most challenging aspect for an enterprise risk control, especially a third-party vendor risk?
There's so much to unpack there. I mean, because you've got the leverage and use of AI, like within PathLock, to bring greater efficiency, effectiveness, agility, resilience, like I was talking about. But then you have the risk of AI itself. And I just did my third-party risk workshops just 2 months ago in New York and Chicago and San Francisco and Houston. Every one of them, there's a lot of concern on how do we govern the use of AI within our third-party relationships. The modern business is not defined by brick and mortar walls and traditional employees. The modern organization is the extended enterprise of suppliers, vendors, contractors, consultants, brokers, agents, dealers, temporary workers, and more. And they're working on your business processes. You walk down the halls of many organizations, and half the people you walk by are not employees. They're contractors or consultants or outsourcers or service providers. And they're leveraging AI and things for your business. And so in those third-party risk management by design workshops I did, every one of them was very concerned on how do we govern, how do we introduce questions in our third-party risk assessment questionnaires that ask about the use of AI and how it's being used and how it's being approved for use within our business context.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you for that answer.
And on the other side, to just remarks, right, we are using already over 100 AI-based products in healthiness, right, for doing radiologic imaging or whatever. So it is a huge chance, but you have to be careful, right? So we see also there's a risk of company data is going out if people using AI, asking there, posting in whole text parts or whatever. So this is dangerous. You need to be aware. And the same thing, it is a chance. Definitely, right? But on the other side, there are some risks. You need to be aware. And in the end, yeah, having again people's mindset. Yeah, people must understand why not doing this and that with an AI, or the other way around. Yeah, understanding how it's working and also make them aware where maybe some topics coming up to double check, right? So this is in the end, it's a supportive thing. Yeah, but you should not blindly trust in the end. And yeah, handle it with care, yeah, and include it carefully, then it's a chance, definitely.
Agreed. I think the IT landscape is always evolving, right? We started with moving things into SaaS applications, and there were all the concerns about what happens when things are on the cloud, multi-tenant versus single tenant, all these questions. And AI is new and it's very impactful and big, but I think just like all the prior changes and evolutions of the IT space, we just have to continue establishing, as Michael said, what are our objectives around this space for controlling and regulating it? And then as Harold said, how do we go in and how do we actually execute on that and just make sure that we are using it for its advantages, but we're being cognizant of the risk.
And try it out, right? Let people really try it out and also let them fail, that they understand what is happening, what is working and what not, right? And this in the end, the experience using it gave them the idea, okay, here I have to double check, I have to look, or here, okay, I can trust this thing, right? So in the end, invest it from the beginning, yeah, try it out and make people aware.
Perfect, thank you. And that's all the time we have for questions, but if you do have any more questions, feel free to reach out to us at info@pathlock.com and we'd be happy to answer any of those or direct the questions to our speakers here. And with that, I just wanted to thank our panelists today for their thoughtful responses and thank all of you for attending, and we hope to see you soon.